All right, so thank you very much, Professor, for the introduction. My name is Charles Boliko. I'm a fourth year student here in the Graduate School of Advanced Integrated Studies in Human Survivability. I'll be talking today about my current research activities here. So first of all, just a general overview of the things I'll be talking about. Just first of all, how this research was conceived, and then talking about how the methodology was developed. And then the case study itself and what the results have been, and then what the policy implications are. Now, for the framework itself, in our school, of course, we like to talk about the idea of survivability studies. Basically, the concept of having a more issue-oriented research concept in which we want to focus on conducting academic activities that contribute to the well-being of society. And there are many different factors that are incorporated into this survivability study. And of course, in my study, I focus on the economic factors, the social factors, and the environmental factor. And so having looked at all of these things in my research, I decided to focus on energy and how it contributes to improving societal well-being. And so in my work, I look to evaluate how rural electrification has, in Kenya, contributed to the societal well-being, the sustainable development of rural communities in Kenya, and developing some policy recommendations for how to disseminate these energy services to rural communities in Kenya. Now, very briefly, as Mr. Singh discussed earlier this morning, and Mr. Professor from Austria talked a little bit about how energy is quite closely related to many of the other sustainable development goals. So this is just a brief overview of how energy in particular can quite directly or indirectly affect the other sustainable development goals. And so energy does play a very important role in promoting the sustainable development objectives that have been established by the United Nations. Now, just again, another brief introduction here. There are various ways in which energy access is provided. First and most importantly, through the national grid, which is, of course, provided for all the different, for nationwide. The mini-grids are usually provided for small villages and towns, and they consist of various sources of energy. It can be fossil fuels, it can be renewables, it really depends on the location. And then standalone systems, so basically for a specific household, we have, for example, a solar panel, which obviously provides the energy services required for the household to meet energy demand. Now, in the next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the literature that has been written regarding energy provision. So these are the different authors that have basically conducted an assessment study of different communities in developing regions. And looking at all of these different academic works, I went ahead and developed my own kind of case study which can be used in order to evaluate the different electrification activities that have been conducted in Kenya in particular. So this is basically how the logical structure of my research had developed. Basically, we have Ms. Elizabeth Ilskog, who proposed in 2008 a new sustainability framework which consists of 5 different dimensions. And so you can see the dimensions here: technical, economic, social, environmental, and institutional. And these dimensions have various indicators that accompany these dimensions. And basically, these different indicators produce a score which leads to an overall score for the respective dimensions. And so based on that kind of framework, we can then come to conclusions about how a particular electrification project is either contributing to the sustainable development community or otherwise. So based on this premise, this is the case study that, this is the framework that I developed myself. You see, as you can see again, the 5 different dimensions and the indicators that accompany each dimension. And so Having looked at the literature, this is the framework that was developed. And I use this framework to evaluate 4 different electrification projects that have been conducted in rural Kenya. Now, of course, to gather data and information, there I am doing research in Kenya. Basically, I conducted interviews and interviews with different households and small businesses in rural Kenya. I distributed some questionnaires so that we can gather the data that can be used in order to compute the scores that are necessary for determining the contribution of various electrification projects to the societal well-being, the sustainable development of a particular community. And so this is just briefly the method that was employed in order to produce the score. So of course, for example, when it comes to education, for example, right, if we're talking about a child who has recently been obtaining access to energy services, if this child, for example, is able to study for a longer period of time, the score will be 1. If the study period hasn't changed as much, the score will be 0.5. And if for in any reason why the study period has decreased, then the score will be 0. This is just kind of the logic of how this methodology was employed for various sectors, so not for various indicators, so not just education, but for environment and et cetera, et cetera. And so these are the 4 projects that were employed. First of all, of course, the grid extension activities that are being conducted in Kenya. There is also a hybrid mini-grid that has been installed in Narok County, which combines solar PV and diesel power. There's also a solar mini-grid in Kisii County that was studied, and additionally, some solar home systems that have been installed across the south of Nairobi in an area called Machakos. Now, these are the areas that were visited. This is the map of Kenya. The areas that are circled in red are the places that have been visited for data collection activities in order to produce the results that are illustrated in this next slide. So here you can see, in the table I produced the scores in order to show how each electrification project or activity has performed on this in this assessment framework. And so obviously tabulate the information, and I also produce a web diagram to kind of show in more detail how each electrification project has performed in this assessment. Now, when it comes to grid extension, well, of course, there's the data, the sample size for each of these different electrification activities was quite limited, and so I focused a lot more also on the qualitative aspects of the electrification project. So what are the circumstances on the ground that led to the answers and the results that have been produced here? And so when it comes to, so I provide some explanations for how, for example, the economic dimension had obtained the score that it did, how the technical dimension had obtained the score that it did. Economically speaking, of course, many of the households, the head of the households are working outside of the houses. So when it comes to providing these kinds of services, they don't really have any necessarily significant impact on how their economic well-being is affected. And so that helps to explain how this particular project has obtained a lower score compared to the other projects in this assessment. Technically, the national grid in Kenya in particular experiences some periodic power outages, especially in rural areas, which last a long time. And of course, this leads to some dissatisfaction about the service. And there were also other things that were mentioned regarding the performance of the system, safety concerns, and how sometimes there are other parties that get involved in grid extension activities which negatively affect the perception of grid extension. As for the hybrid mini-grid that was set up in the county of Narok, it's a business town, and so in this area, when you visit, you have a lot of small shops that are set up all across the entire village. And basically what you see is that all these people that are working in these businesses are living pretty much exactly where their businesses operate. And so when they have their businesses, when they're living exactly where their businesses are located, these are the kind of results that were produced based on the results, based on the interviews that were conducted. So I visited 8 households. I didn't see the necessity to visit more because the data was becoming very consistent. And when looking at the surroundings and the circumstances and how the responses were becoming quite repetitive, I decided, well, okay, this is a sufficient amount of data. I also talked to people that were responsible for installing the systems, of course, in the village. And so these were some of the results that were produced. Of course, the managers reported that 125 new jobs were produced as a result of the installation of this hybrid PV diesel mini-grid. 40 new businesses were created as a result of this installation. And of course, most households are businesses, and they reported a positive impact on the incomes that are being produced by these various businesses. Technically, there have been a few challenges, especially when it comes to temporary power outages because of limited supply for diesel fuel. And so that caused the cost of obtaining these energy services to increase. And so when these announcements were made in this community, of course, people were not very happy with that situation. And so that kind of created tensions between the managerial party and the consumers of the energy services. The solar mini-grid that was installed in Kisii County, 33 households were visited, and in this county in particular, many of the households are farmers in the tea sector, the agricultural sector, and so many of the activities that are conducted there have been affected by the installation of the solar mini-grid. Of course, this set of households in particular, they are of the lower income category, and they rely on a lot of, it's basically the use of fossil fuels for lighting their household, for example, for various agricultural activities. Those kinds of things, of course, it has been written in the literature. There was a reduced reliance on these kinds of resources. And so this fact was primarily pointed out as a major factor for the improvements in the economic condition of the households here. And of course, when we talk about that in the economic dimension, environmentally, it's also quite closely related. The reduced reliance on kerosene fuels helps to improve the environmental score for this project. And of course, the social dimension, when we're talking about health, reduced reliance on kerosene fuels, of course, helps to improve the health score. For the final electrification project that was conducted in Kenya, it's a small private company that installed some solar home systems across the region of Machakos, which is right in the south of Nairobi. And this project in particular, when talking to managers and talking to the households, they seem to have an excellent relationship between each other. And so people are very happy with the services that have been provided. If there has ever been a particular issue with the technical performance of the solar home system, there is someone on the spot that is ready to assist in repairing or fixing all the different issues that are being dealt with by the household. And so it is, the people are very happy with this, with these services, and these observations on the ground have also helped to contribute to the higher scores that have been obtained in this project. And so just looking at the results that have been produced so far, the solar mini-grid and the solar home systems that have been installed, they're part of the private sector, and they have they have obtained higher scores in the sustainability assessment, which illustrates that the private sector is very much capable of contributing to the sustainable development of rural areas in Kenya. Now, of course, this research is obviously in progress, but what are some implications, some recommendations regarding policy? The energy sector in Kenya is dominated by the government in particular. And so when it comes to making recommendations, it is first and foremost really important to help provide greater support for these private sector companies, and there are various ways in which that can be done, which is by, of course, easing some regulations that are making it more difficult for private sector businesses to operate, and also to consider companies in the private sector to become partners in efforts to achieve 100% rural electrification or national electrification, which is an objective that has been set by the government of Kenya. And so these are, of course, some of the recommendations that have been put in place to this point. So in conclusion, basically in my research, I have adapted a sustainability assessment framework that can be used in a Kenyan case study, and found that the private sector is very much capable of promoting the sustainable development necessary for improving societal well-being and helping to maintain the human survivability that we like to discuss here in our graduate school. And the reasons why the data, the sample size was so limited. In this past year when I visited, there was an election going on. There was an election campaign, and so there was some survey site instability, and so there were some limitations regarding the different places that can be visited, and there was also some trust issues and communication issues, and so that made it a little bit more harder to obtain the data necessary, but I did the best that I could with the resources at my disposal, and so that pretty much concludes my presentation. And so thank you very much for your patience and your attention. These are some resources, and that's it for now. All right, thank you.